talking about population issues, which is a huge topic, and I have 35 minutes, and I'll probably leave maybe like 10 minutes for questions and answers. So I studied political economy in undergrad, and now I'm getting a doctorate in sociology and demography. And for 2 years I worked at the Population Research Institute, which is a pro-life nonprofit dedicated to documenting, exposing, and ending coercive population control programs. So this is kind of my bread and butter, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I think population control is without doubt, well, I think it's definitely the largest systematic human rights abuse of the past half century, which is a huge claim to make. I think I can back it up. It's definitely without a doubt the biggest human rights abuse topic that people aren't talking about. It's the largest systematic human rights violations that people just don't think about, don't talk about. So first, before we get into some of the population control abuses, I'm going to go more into some of the nerdy stuff, talking about overpopulation, what it is, are we overpopulated, and hopefully before you get really bored talking about fertility rates, I'll go more into some of the personal faces of victims of population control. So first off, I find when talking about overpopulation of people, a lot of people don't really have a clear idea of what it is. They have a general idea. They talk about it sort of in terms of effects, like, well, I think it's overpopulated, it looks really crowded. I think that place is overpopulated, they have a lot of pollution. Like, okay, but you're not actually defining population control, you're just talking about things that you think might be caused by it. So when I talk about overpopulation, the way I define it is it's a situation where the number of people exhausts the resources in a closed environment such that it can't support that population. And I think the two key points in that definition are that it's the number of people, right? So it's not policies, it's not programs, it's not an economic structure, it's not a political regime, but it's the number of people that is causing a problem. And it's a closed environment, right? So, for instance, this lecture hall, if it were a closed environment, would be overpopulated. Right? There's not enough water in here to sustain this population for a while. There's enough sanitation, there's definitely not enough food growing in here. But we're not worried, we're not talking about who we should sterilize in here, because it's not a closed environment, right? So New York City would be overpopulated if it were a closed environment. Some countries, if they were a closed environment, would be overpopulated. But the world as a whole is not. And I think a lot of the symptoms that people look at when they say, I think that looks like overpopulation, aren't really caused by numbers of people, but are caused by bad policies. People talk about pollution a lot. And in our country, in America, our population has grown a lot since the 70s. But our environment's a lot cleaner in terms of emissions and outputs because we've changed our policies. And so if people don't say, oh, the US is overpopulated, look at all the pollution, because it's not a numbers problem, it was a policy problem. So I'm also going to give you a quick, I realize most people don't know a ton about demography, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of world population trends and what's trending. It's actually a great time to be interested in demography. If any of you want to study it, I would recommend it. Because it's a very new thing going on in terms of human history. In the last couple hundred years, the world population did explode. So that's true. And like 100 years ago, the world population was 1.5 billion. Now it's over 7 billion, right? So that's actually a huge jump. But I'm not particularly worried about it. I wouldn't say the world is overpopulated, because that was a jump that happened once, and it's never going to happen again. World population growth is slowing, and there's a reason why it's slowing. So for most of human history, what happened was women had a lot of children. A lot of those children didn't make it. There was very high fertility, but there was really high mortality. So the world population growth just kind of chugged along at really low numbers for a really long time. And then people stopped dying. Infants started living, people started living longer. And so mortality dropped. But fertility stayed pretty high for a while because it just took people a little bit of time to figure out we weren't dying as fast anymore. And so in that period when people were still having a lot of children and not dying, there was a huge population boom. And then after a while, the world fertility slowed out. So right now, I think the average world fertility is about 2.5 kids on average. So some countries are still going through that transition, right? There are some places where people, like Niger, the average fertility rate is still 7, but their mortality is still pretty high too. But just as our parents saw that huge boom that occurred, right? So my mom was born, she's getting away from telling you this. My mom was born in the 50s, and she saw the world population add billions of people up at a time throughout her life. So that was a unique thing that happened once. Our parents' generation saw it, but it's never going to happen again. What our generation is currently seeing is another demographic phenomenon that's happening for the first time in human history, is wealthy, successful nations that are shrinking. They're failing to reproduce themselves. So in general, throughout human history, populations shrink if there's like a war, or a huge famine, or like the Black Plague. But what we have is the wealthiest nations in the world, Japan, Germany, Russia, the United States, with fertility rates that are below replacement. And some of you are taking notes. If you only write one thing down as a fun fertility fact to take away, half of the world's population lives in a country with below replacement fertility. So that means half of the world, even if they're not shrinking yet, so the United States isn't shrinking yet because women just sort of made that transition. So the higher fertility generations that are older are still around. They haven't died yet. The population's still growing, but slowly. But if you keep it up, like Japan, like Russia, who's had these low fertility rates for decades, you're going to start shrinking, and you're going to start shrinking quickly. So that's the real nerdy stuff that's over. And I'm going to talk about, I think, 3 population control campaigns that every pro-life person really needs to know about. I think everyone needs to know about, even if you're not pro-life. One of the smaller ones, compared to some of the others, but still huge, but a lot of people don't know about, occurred in Peru in the 90s under Alberto Fujimori. He enacted a population control campaign of forced sterilizations. Over several years, 300,000 women were forcibly sterilized, mostly indigenous, native, illiterate, poor women. So it hit them the hardest. Fujimori was the first person to stand trial in an international court for crimes against humanity for forced sterilization. He was the first person since the Nazi war crimes to have to go on trial. And that trial was not that long ago. It was, I think, 2 years ago maybe, but a lot of people still don't know about it. And it's pretty recent history. The second one, which I think everyone has heard of, but very few people outside of China really understand well, is China's population control policy. So I think if I had a sort of Captain America situation where I met someone who had been like frozen asleep for like 50 years, and I had to explain to them some of like the really big things that happened in the last 50 years, I would definitely mention China's population control policy in addition to like internet and all that kind of stuff. Because without a doubt, it is the policy that I would say most dramatically influences our world today. If nothing else, because of sheer numbers. 1/5 of the world lives in China. So this is a policy that influences the day-to-day life of a lot of our world. Even if we don't come into day-to-day interaction with these people, it's 1/5 of the world, and this is a huge part of their life from the moment they're conceived to the moment that they die. And I think you have to understand the one-child policy. So the one-child policy was instituted nationwide in the late 70s. There had been sort of smaller county-wide pilot programs in China before that where they were trying it out, but it went nationwide in the late 70s. So the way it works is there are targets for the total population, there are targets for the birth rate, and these are broken down into counties and given out. And couples in China have to have a birth permit in order to legally give birth. Again, most people have heard of China's population control policy, but when I say that, especially to Americans, it just sort of just jars with the Western mind. The idea that you have to have a permit to give birth doesn't even really make sense. what that would mean for a couple, what that would mean for your daily life. I would also like to point out that the international community in 1994 has publicly stated that targets always lead to abuse. So this is kind of, if you think about it, there's no way you can have a system of targeted sterilization, targeted abortion that doesn't lead to abuse, that really honors the free will and the agency of a woman. So under the Chinese population policy, a woman can't be eligible for a birth permit until she's 23. Okay, so if you're pregnant before then, you can either give birth to a legal child or have an abortion. One of the things that bothers me most when talking to people about one-child policy now is it's not really exactly a strict one-child policy, and it hasn't been for a while. Certain couples are eligible for 2 births. More couples in the last couple of years have been eligible for 2 births because China's realized, wait, we're running out of people. Not in running out, but like, oh my gosh, we now have a ton of old people, we have a huge problem of sex selection, maybe we should allow more births. But that does not mean the population control program in China is over. The totalitarian, authoritarian hold on reproduction is still there because there's still a system of birth permits. So even though more people are eligible to apply, you can still get denied. And people are still being denied, people who apply for these birth permits. So how is this policy enforced? Some of it is through outright force. A lot of it, however, is through sort of like weird systems that stack everything against having a birth, right? So if you get pregnant with an illegal child, you can pay a fine. And I don't mean like a parking ticket fine. They normally do it in terms of like how much of your household income per year times 5. So in American terms, it would be like $250,000 to $2 million for an illegal child. So I have a friend at Penn State. She's one of 4. She's from China. And I was like, how are you one of 4? She's like, oh, my parents are really rich. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I'm glad they were able to pay those fines. So also, you can give birth. China says we don't make you have an abortion, but if you have an illegal child, your child is not legally recognized by the state. They're an illegal alien in their own country. They're outside of the law. They don't exist. They can't attend public schools. They can't get permission to travel. They can't legally get hired. They can't get government medical care. Of course, they can't get a passport. One woman from China, the place that I worked at, where we interviewed, she said, no school, no job, no trips by train, no chance of marriage. Of course, she's not eligible for a birth permit. It is even impossible to buy a cold remedy from the pharmacy. I can't stand a life with no legal identity. My parents broke the one-child policy, but why should I suffer? I can't borrow a book from the library or get a position as an hourly worker. It's horrible to think of my life if my parents were to leave me. Sometimes the girl I met at Penn State, even though her parents paid the fines, after the 4th kid, the government said, nope, can't work for the government anymore. So again, it's not, well, sometimes they physically drive women to have an abortion, but sometimes it's like, well, if you want to keep your job, you can't have a kid. Other times it's just really harsh propaganda. So a lot of Chinese people who are otherwise well-educated honestly believe that it's an issue of like national public safety. Imagine if growing up all your life you heard you have to have only one child. If you have another one, it's like treason against the party. PRI, the place where I used to work, published a bunch of images of propaganda posters just taken around the countryside, taken in cities. They're sort of daily posters. One of them read, call back those who are located far away, dig out those who are hidden, those who are pregnant outside the policy absolutely must have labor induced. Those who should be sterilized absolutely must be dragged in. So again, in the Western mind, if you saw a poster like that, or a lot of countries that have like a decent amount of democracy and freedom, if you saw that kind of poster on your way to work, put up by your government, it just wouldn't even really compute. You're like, what? The government's going to drag us out? If we have a child, if I have an illegal child, I must be dragged in to have an IUD inserted? But that's the kind of sort of like constant messaging that's put out throughout a lot of China. Another thing that really bothers me is when people say, like, oh, well, desired fertility in China is not that high anyway. And I'm like, well, yeah, they've had decades of like a really forceful propaganda. Surprise, surprise, it kind of worked. Which, again, I don't think is a good argument for the policy. Like, great, the propaganda worked. That doesn't mean they're like good on human rights. Some people also say that the policy isn't that bad. It's not out of the question that you'll meet someone in China, and they'll be like, yeah, it wasn't that bad where I'm from. I don't know anyone who's had a forced abortion. But in some places, it's up to the local party discretion, and they don't enforce it that much. But if your best argument for a policy is that sometimes it's not enforced, it's a pretty bad policy. If that's like the best you can come up with. But the largest population of reproductive age women in the world lives in China. And this is their daily reality. The government prefers metal IUDs to others because it's easily seen in an X-ray. It's easily monitored. Just the kind of day-to-day intrusion into one's personal and reproductive life that is the result of this policy, I think is very hard to understand if you don't really read a lot about it or grow up with it. And it's very, I would say, manipulative in a lot of ways, because sometimes if a woman's pregnant with an illegal child, they'll go to her neighbors, they'll go to the family. And so like even once you're out of your reproductive age, if you have a daughter who's in reproductive age, you're liable to still have the family planning police come to your door. If even when you're in your 60s, you're done with all of your childbearing, but if your daughter has an illegal child, the family planning police can come to your door and be like, hey, you gotta get your daughter to come in for an abortion. So the family planning police are there, they're around. If the family planning police were a separate army, they would be in the top 10, in terms of size, they would be in the top 10 armies in the world. It's huge, it's a huge bureaucracy. And they're not really accountable in the way that a lot of other, as accountable as a lot of the organizations, government organizations within China are. So the second largest population of reproductive women in the world is in India. And India's track record is slightly better than China's, but it's still not great. How much time do I have? 10? Okay. Did you say? Okay, sorry. So in the 70s, India went through what was called an emergency planning campaign, where the nation went to a period of what was an emergency, and therefore the prime minister had sort of authoritarian control for a little bit. She used this power to enact a nationwide sterilization campaign. States received targets for sterilizations, and in this campaign, unlike a lot of other population control programs, it was mostly the men. So men were brought in to have a vasectomy. This didn't work. So in a couple years, I think like 20-something months, 11 million men were sterilized. Obviously, consent, not so much. But fun fact, if you forcibly sterilize men, they get a lot more violent a lot more quickly than if you forcibly sterilize women. So there are a bunch of family planning riots. Again, something I think that sounds weird to most of us. But men took to the streets. They were like, stop forcibly vasectomizing us, especially because it hit minority people a lot harder. And so as soon as the emergency period was over, Indira Gandhi got voted out. And they didn't try that again for a while, and they switched over to women. So right now, the current state of sterilization in India is it's not a federal program. India is a democratic republic, meaning that a lot of these programs are on a statewide level. So India's national policy is we don't do targets. We don't do targets for sterilization. But on the state level, they set targets for sterilization. And the states receive their health funding from the federal government. So when India says they don't, I'm like, that's nice. You say you don't, but you do. So the current state of sterilization in India is that 1 out of 3 women in India have been sterilized. By the age of 35, half of women in India have been sterilized. And the informed consent statistics are abysmal. 68% of women who have been sterilized say that they weren't informed about other methods of family planning that they could use. A third of sterilized women say that they weren't told that the procedure was permanent. And the actual conditions are horrendous. A lot of people say, you know what, just the health system in India in general isn't that good. I don't think that's an excuse. If 3 women a week die from botched sterilizations, that's a problem, especially when the government has a system of targeted sterilization. If your federal government is funding sterilization camps, I don't care if you just have a problem in general with health and sanitation. If 3 women a week are dying, that's a low estimate, that's a problem. So I think it's fair to say that population control is the largest systematic human rights abuse of the half century. It's definitely the human rights abuse that's not being talked about. I hope you guys will help talk about it, hope it make a human rights abuse that people do talk about, and say, you know what, the world isn't overpopulated. And even if it was, you can't do this, right? Even if the world was overpopulated, these are unjustified. You know what, it's not even overpopulated. Another thing I want you guys to think about is the countries that you're from. Look into where the funding is going. I probably apologize on behalf of my government to the good people of the Philippines. USAID, our international aid agency, in 2014 gave $23 million to the Philippines for family planning. They gave $4 million to the Philippines for maternal and child health, and $1 million for water and sanitation. So yeah, we're helping the Philippines with their water and sanitation. Yeah, we're helping with maternal and child's health. But if you care about maternal health, you're not going to give how much is that? 5.5 times more on family planning than you're giving for maternal health. So there's this weird, so they say, oh, family planning is about women. Really? Because it looks a lot like population control from where I'm standing. Just because you call it family planning doesn't mean that that's necessarily what it is, especially when the people of the Philippines say, you know what, we don't want this. But international aid agencies come in and say, no, I think you do. And that's very offensive. There's a lot of people here from Africa. Talk to them. Be like, what are international aid agencies doing in your countries? Do the people want it? It's disguised as foreign aid, but a lot of it is population control, which is really harmful to the legitimate aid programs that are going on. You want women to be able to trust foreign aid when they do need maternal health. You don't want them to be scared that it's actually population control. So I think I'm running out of time.